Welcome, weary traveler. Tonight, we take a slow, quiet journey through time all the way back to the dusty, damp corridors of the medieval world. A world where candlelight flickered on stone walls, where the air often smelled of wood smoke and mud, and where life was, for many, harsh and short. But for women, it was something else entirely: brutal. Let's set the stage. The period we're talking about, the so-called medieval era, stretched from around the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, all the way up to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th. That's about 1,000 years of history, give or take a decade or two. 1,000 years. A millennium where power, knowledge, and freedom flowed in one direction, away from women. The early centuries of this period are sometimes called the Dark Ages, and while historians today argue about whether that's fair, there's no debate that society was heavily stratified. That means it was built like a pyramid, wide at the bottom with peasants and laborers, and narrow at the top with kings, lords, and the church. And if men were on the rungs of that social ladder, women were often not even allowed on it at all. Let's talk about feudalism for a moment. Imagine a world where land equals power. A king might own all the land in a country, but he would parcel it out to nobles, dukes, counts, barons, in exchange for loyalty and military support. These lords then leased their land to knights or lesser nobles, who in turn demanded service and taxes from the peasant farmers, who worked the soil. It was a rigid hierarchy, enforced by tradition, by oaths, and, most importantly, by violence. Where, you might ask, were the women in all this? Almost always, at the very bottom. A woman could not own land in most cases. She could not inherit property unless there were no male heirs. She could not make legal contracts without her husband or father. She was, in nearly every sense, legally invisible. A vessel for producing heirs, a tool of alliance through marriage, a servant of the home, and a servant of the fields. Life for a peasant woman, which was the fate of the vast majority, was a life of toil. Not quiet work, but constant, physical labor, hauling water, grinding grain, tending crops, raising children, cooking over open flames, and weaving cloth until her fingers bled. Her work was not romanticized, not honored, not even properly recorded. It was simply expected. She worked beside her husband in the fields, and then returned home to do everything else. And if you imagine noblewomen lived lives of ease, you'd be only half right. Yes, they had servants, they had silk gowns and castle walls, but they also had no freedom. Their marriages were contracts, sealed with signatures they didn't write. Their role was to produce heirs, manage the household, and obey their husbands, even when their husbands were cruel. To rebel was to risk disgrace or worse. Over all of this loomed the towering presence of the church. The medieval church was not just a place of worship, it was the great ideological engine of the era. It dictated morality, education, politics, and behavior, and at its core was a belief system that placed women beneath men, inherently, spiritually, and eternally. Why? Because Eve. Because of the biblical story in Genesis, where Eve eats the forbidden fruit and leads Adam astray. This tale, just one story among thousands, became the moral cornerstone for the way women were viewed, as temptresses, as weak-willed, as the source of sin. The clergy taught that a woman's body was shameful, her mind was simple, and her soul needed constant supervision. And so, for 1,000 years, women were taught to be quiet, to be obedient, to accept their suffering as divine design. Their silence was not only expected, it was enforced by fathers, by husbands, by priests, and sometimes by fire and rope. But even in silence, they endured. Even in the margins, they survived. As we drift deeper into this tale, you'll hear about the brutalities they faced, from the cradle to the grave. You'll hear about the work, the pain, the laws, the punishments, the constraints of gender in a world that feared and suppressed femininity. It is a grim story, but one worth telling slowly, softly, with care. So lay your head down, let the echoes of the past hum quietly like a lullaby, and let's begin to uncover the many layers of what it meant to be a woman in the medieval world. This isn't a story of queens and fairy tale castles. It's a story of real women, forgotten women, who lived through a time when their voices were silenced, their bodies were controlled, and their worth was measured in obedience. And yet, somehow, they lived on, Close your eyes for a moment and picture a medieval village. A cluster of wooden homes with thatched roofs. A dirt road winding past livestock and muddy children. Smoke curling from chimneys into the gray morning sky. In this world, life begins early, and innocence ends quickly, especially if you were born a girl. To be a child in the medieval period was to be born into work, but to be a female child, that was something different entirely. From the moment she entered the world, her path was narrow and fraught with expectations. In a world governed by land, labor, and legacy, sons were prize. A male child was a future plow hand, a potential knight, an heir. But a daughter, she was a cost, a liability, a future dowry to be paid, another mouth to feed, and a body to guard against dishonor. Even in the cradle, she carried the weight of being less. There were no birthday parties, no toys beyond what could be carved from scrap or stitched from cloth, no quiet corners to dream of becoming a scholar or painter. Childhood for peasant girls was not a prelude to possibility. It was simply the first stage of labor. By the time she could walk, she would follow her mother. She would watch her gather herbs, tend chickens, weave cloth. She'd learn to knead dough, to fetch water, to hush babies, to kneel and obey. Her lessons were taught by repetition, not reading. Few women could read, and fewer still were taught. Latin, law, literature, these were for boys. And yet, her education was constant, just not the kind you find in books. She learned that her body was not her own. She was taught to keep her eyes downcast, her voice soft, her hands busy. She learned that her worth would be measured by her purity, her obedience, her ability to serve, first her father, then her husband, and later, her sons. Even in noble households, where daughters might receive instruction in music or French, the end goal was the same: prepare her for marriage. A noble girl might be taught how to dance, how to sing, how to manage a household, but always through the lens of what would make her more desirable to a future husband. She was not being educated for independence. She was being trained for a transaction, and that transaction often came alarmingly soon. By the age of 12, sometimes even younger, a girl might be betrothed, not because she was ready, but because her father had debts, or her family needed an alliance, or her chastity was seen as most valuable while it was still unquestioned. A girl could legally be married as early as 12 in many parts of medieval Europe. In practice, this often meant young teenagers, still children in every meaningful way, were bound in lifelong contracts with grown men. The marriage itself wasn't always consummated immediately, but it was official. The girl's fate was sealed. She no longer belonged to her father. She belonged to someone else now. Her body was no longer her own. It was her husband's property. Her life would now be shaped by childbirth, service, and silence. Of course, not all girls made it to marriage. The infant and child mortality rate in the medieval period was staggering. In some areas, only 1 in 3 children lived past the age of 5. Poor nutrition, disease, and unsanitary conditions meant that many lives were short, and many deaths unrecorded. A girl's death might pass with barely a mention, her name soon forgotten, her memory absorbed into the churn of history. For those who survived, adolescence brought its own challenges. Menstruation, today, a rite of biological passage, was in the medieval world often met with fear, shame, and misinformation. It marked the beginning of womanhood, yes, but it also marked the beginning of even tighter restrictions. Her sexuality, even though she likely didn't understand it, was now considered a threat. She was told to cover herself more modestly, to avoid laughter, to walk behind others, to fear her own body. In some regions, girls were sent to convents, not always for religious reasons, sometimes simply because their families couldn't afford to keep them. A convent could offer education, food, and protection, but it also meant vows of chastity, obedience, and silence. The doors might not be locked, but they may as well have been. And for those whose families were especially poor or desperate, the options were even bleaker. Some were sold into servitude, sent to wealthier households to work as maids or kitchen hands. Others were married off to older men, or even trafficked under the guise of apprenticeship. Abuse, both physical and sexual, was tragically common and rarely punished. The church, the single most powerful institution in medieval Europe, did little to help. In fact, it often reinforced the subjugation of girls. Religious texts preached obedience. Priests taught that female sin began in the cradle, that girls, even more than boys, needed to be tamed. The story of Eve hung like a shadow over every childhood, a reminder that a woman's disobedience once ruined paradise and must never be repeated. And so, childhood for medieval girls was not a sanctuary, it was a corridor, a dim, narrow passageway that led quickly toward the responsibilities and hardships of adult womanhood. But despite all of this, despite the oppression, the silence, the burdens, there were moments of light, little rebellions, girls who laughed behind haystacks, who whispered stories to one another by firelight, who snuck away to watch the stars or dream of something more. They were not saints, nor symbols, nor shadows. They were real. We just rarely get to hear about them. History, you see, rarely recorded the lives of ordinary girls. Their voices didn't make it into the scrolls or court records unless they broke the rules, unless they ran away, or were caught stealing, or were accused of witchcraft. Otherwise, they were invisible, anonymous. But tonight, we remember them quietly, softly. As you begin to drift into sleep, let your mind wander to the narrow cobblestone lanes, where young girls once played, worked, and endured. Their childhoods were brief, their joys were fleeting, but their existence mattered. Their stories deserve to be whispered, even if history forgot to write them down. And so we move forward now, from childhood to womanhood, and with it, the cold reality of medieval marriage. In the next chapter, we'll step into the world of bridal veils and iron chains, and the brutal truths behind medieval matrimony. And so, the girl becomes a woman, not by choice, not by age, but by marriage. In the medieval world, marriage was not a celebration of love. It was a contract, a transaction, a transfer of ownership. And for women, it was one of the most brutal realities they would face. Let's start with a harsh truth. In most of medieval Europe, women had no legal say in their marriage. They could not choose their husbands. They could not refuse a match. Their marriages were arranged, sometimes when they were still toddlers, by fathers, uncles, or older brothers seeking alliances, land, or influence. Love, that was for poems. Real life was ruled by property and power. A noble daughter might be promised to a boy she'd never met in a distant province to cement a truce between families. A peasant girl might be pushed into marrying a widower twice her age, simply because he had a cow and her father didn't. It didn't matter if she cried. It didn't matter if she begged. She was a vessel, a bridge, a bargaining chip. The church officially claimed that marriage required consent from both parties. But this was more theory than practice. And consent was a vague concept when the bride was 12 years old, underfed, and terrified. That age wasn't uncommon. Canon law set the minimum legal age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. And while consummation could sometimes be delayed, it often wasn't. Once the vows were spoken, the woman, yes, the child, belonged to her husband. He could touch her, use her, punish her. Legally, it wasn't rape, because once married, a woman no longer had the right to say no. There are records of girls bleeding to death on their wedding nights. No poetic metaphors here, just cold, medical reality. A child's body forced into a role it wasn't built for. There were no doctors, no help, no mercy, and no outrage. Marriage was considered sacred, indissoluble. To break a marriage was to challenge both God and society. So, once bound, the woman had no escape. Divorce, as we understand it today, did not exist. Annulments were rare and difficult, usually reserved for royalty with influence in the church. For everyone else, rich or poor, marriage was forever, even if it was violent, even if it was cruel. A husband could beat his wife. In many regions, this was not only allowed, but encouraged, as a form of correction. As long as he didn't kill her, it was considered his right, his duty, even, to keep her obedient. The law might intervene if a man murdered his wife outright, but even then, punishments were often light. A slap on the wrist, a fine, maybe a public confession. For women, there was no justice. And yet, marriage was presented as the pinnacle of a woman's life. She was told from the moment she could walk that her value lay in becoming a wife. Everything, her chores, her behavior, her appearance, was shaped around making her marriageable. If she failed to marry, she became a burden, a failure, an object of pity, or suspicion, because a single woman was dangerous. She was uncontrolled. She didn't belong to a man. She might make her own decisions, and in the eyes of the church and society, that made her suspect. Spinsters were often accused of witchcraft or blamed for bad harvests. If she had a child out of wedlock, the shame could destroy her. She might be whipped, branded, or banished. And the child, if allowed to live, would be called a bastard, excluded from inheritance and honor. But let's go back to the wife, the good woman, the one who obeyed. What did her life look like? She rose before dawn. She fed her husband and children. She worked in the fields or in the home, often both. She spun wool, baked bread, slaughtered animals, cleaned wounds, managed servants, raised infants. She was expected to be industrious, silent, and chaste. If she complained, she was scolded. If she grew ill or tired, she was lazy. If she disobeyed, she was punished. Her body was not her own. It existed for reproduction, and pregnancies came one after another, year after year. Many women gave birth 10, 12, even 15 times. But midwives were not always available, and medical knowledge was primitive. Infection, hemorrhage, stillbirth, these were common. Death in childbirth was so frequent, it was considered almost routine. And if she survived, she went back to work the next day. The church preached that marriage was a sacred bond, that husbands were to be loved and obeyed, and that wives should find joy in their suffering. Saints were held up as examples, women who bore beatings and starvation with quiet smiles, as if pain were proof of piety. Martyrdom wasn't just for the saints, it was the daily reality of married life. Even noble women, with their silks and castles, were trapped. Their movements were restricted, their letters read, their friends chosen for them. They were expected to embody purity, grace, and submission. If they spoke out, they were labeled hysterical. If they rebelled, they could be locked away, sometimes in towers, sometimes in convents. The irony, of course, was that men could be unfaithful with few consequences. Noblemen had mistresses. Kings fathered dozens of illegitimate children. But a woman caught in adultery, she could be flogged, disfigured, even executed. In some towns, she was forced to wear shame clothes, garments dyed yellow, or with humiliating symbols sewn on them, to mark her as unclean. In every corner of marriage, the woman paid the price. And yet, they endured. Some found small freedoms in their routines. Some formed bonds with other women, with sisters, cousins, maids, creating pockets of solidarity in a world that gave them none. Some wrote letters, some prayed, some told stories, whispered in kitchens or sung in lobbies, about lives that might have been different. These were not the stories of queens and knights. These were the hidden histories, the lives of millions of wives whose names never made it into the scrolls. Women who gave everything and were forgotten, but not by us, not tonight. So as you close your eyes and drift deeper into sleep, remember them, the girl brides, the silenced wives, the ones who wore their wedding veils like shackles. They were not weak, they were not helpless, they were survivors. And in the next chapter, we will follow them into the next stage of this brutal journey, motherhood. A blessing, they were told, but in the medieval world, it was often a death sentence. And now, she is a mother. That's what they told her she was meant to be. What God wanted. What her family expected. What her body, they said, was designed for. In the medieval world, motherhood was considered the highest calling for a woman. A sacred role, wrapped in symbolism and expectation. But the truth, it was also one of the deadliest. To become a mother in the Middle Ages was not the gentle journey we imagine today. It was dangerous. It was terrifying, and all too often it was fatal. Let us begin with the pregnancy itself. Medieval medicine, if we can call it that, was based on a fragile mix of superstition, ancient texts, and trial and error guesswork. There were no ultrasounds, no prenatal care, no antibiotics. A woman might realize she was pregnant when her body began to change. Her monthly bleeding stopped, her appetite shifted, her feet swelled. And then, she waited. There were no doctors for poor women, only midwives, experienced older women, who passed down knowledge from one generation to the next. Some were skilled, others were not. Herbs were used to ease pain or induce labor. Prayers were muttered, talismans were hung. And yet, nothing could change the reality. Childbirth was the single most dangerous moment in a medieval woman's life. Think about that. A woman could live through plague, through famine, through war, but it was childbirth that posed the greatest threat. Without sterile tools or understanding of infection, even the most routine birth could turn deadly. The mother might bleed to death. The baby could be turned the wrong way. The umbilical cord could choke the child. The afterbirth might not come out fully, leading to days of fever and agony until death. Women who survived one birth were expected to go through it again, and again, and again. 10 children, not unusual. 15, not unheard of. But for every birth, there was a gamble. Some women died on the birthing bed. Others were left permanently injured. One condition, known as fistula, left women with tearing that caused them to leak urine or feces continuously, a horrifying injury that brought shame, isolation, and sometimes exile. There were no surgeries to fix it, no relief, just silence. And it wasn't just the mother at risk. Babies died at staggering rates. 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 3, didn't survive infancy. The causes were many: poor nutrition, infection, congenital issues, cold winters, contaminated milk. The cradle was a quiet place because death came often, but mourning was complicated. A peasant woman, who buried 3 infants, might not even have time to grieve. She was needed in the fields the next morning. She still had other children to feed. The loss became part of the rhythm of life, endured in silence, rarely spoken of. And what of the surviving children? The woman was expected to care for them all, to feed them, clothe them, protect them, teach them. She had no days off, no maternity leave, no rest. If she was noble, she might have wet nurses or servants, but the emotional pressure remained. She was judged not only by how many children she bore, but by how well she raised them. If her sons were weak, it was her fault. If her daughters were disobedient, she had failed. She might be 30 years old and have the body of someone twice that. Stooped, worn, teeth missing, hair thinning, her body a map of scars and stretch marks, of strength never celebrated. And through all of it, the church taught that motherhood was holy, that Mary, the mother of Christ, was the ideal to emulate, pure, obedient, humble. But Mary's story, immaculate, painless, miraculous, bore little resemblance to the reality most women faced. There were no angels at the bedside, no miracles in the night, just pain, blood, and the scream of a child entering a brutal world. Clergy preached that suffering made women closer to God, that pain was a virtue, that a mother's endurance was divine. And so, many women learned not to cry out, not to resist, to take the agony as a form of piety. But what of those who couldn't bear children? In a world where fertility was a woman's main value, infertility was a curse. It was almost always blamed on the woman, even if the husband was at fault. She was said to be cursed, sinful, or barren. Whispers would follow her. She might be replaced, cast aside. Her husband could petition the church for an annulment. Her worth vanished the moment she failed to produce an heir. And for those who tried to avoid pregnancy, there were no reliable methods of birth control. Some women used herbs or rituals to try to prevent conception, but they were rarely effective. Worse still, such efforts could be seen as sinful, or even criminal. If a woman was caught trying to prevent a birth or end a pregnancy, she might be accused of sorcery or murder. The fear wasn't only social, it was legal. Abortion, even when done to save a woman's life, could be considered heresy. The law was rarely consistent, but the message was clear. Her body did not belong to her. It belonged to her husband, to the church, to her role. And yet, amidst all of this suffering, mothers still loved. They sang lullabies, told stories, shared bread from their own mouths when there wasn't enough to go around. They taught children how to walk, how to pray, how to survive. They wove their love into blankets, into kisses, into whispered goodnights, knowing, always, that death might come too soon, that their babies might not outlive the winter, that they themselves might not survive the next birth. History remembers kings and wars, but not these women, not their sacrifices, not their quiet courage. So tonight, we remember them. The mothers who walked barefoot in the snow to find herbs, who nursed sick infants with chat hands and sleepless eyes, who gave their bodies, their time, their everything, and were thanked with silence, with anonymity. Let the world sleep, and let their memory stir. In the next part of our journey, we'll leave the home and step into the wider world, a world where laws were made by men, for men, and where a woman's very existence could be considered a crime. Now imagine, for a moment, being invisible, not to the eye, but to the law. Imagine living in a world where you could not own property, could not testify in court, could not protect your children, and could not even be considered a full person under the law. That was the reality for women in the medieval period. Laws during this time weren't just written by men, they were written for men. The entire legal framework of feudal Europe was designed to serve landowners, soldiers, clergy, and lords, all of whom were male. A woman, whether peasant or noble, had little to no legal identity of her own. She was someone's daughter, then someone's wife, then someone's mother. Her name, her body, her rights, all filtered through the men in her life. This legal structure had a name, coverture, a concept that meant a married woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. She could not sue, or be sued. She could not sign a contract. She could not buy land. If she earned money, perhaps by spinning, brewing ale, or selling goods, that money legally belonged to her husband. She did not exist as an independent legal entity. She was, quite literally, absorbed into him. Widows had slightly more freedom, emphasis on slightly. If their husbands died and they had no male relatives to control them, they might inherit land, or manage a household, but this was rare and temporary. Many widows were pressured into remarrying quickly, especially if they were young and fertile. Why? Because society was uncomfortable with independent women. A widow with land was seen as a threat. A woman who didn't need a man was a problem that needed fixing. And what happened when women broke the law? They were punished, but not always for what you'd expect. A woman accused of theft might be branded or whipped. A woman accused of adultery might be publicly humiliated, imprisoned, or even executed. But more often than not, the law was less interested in her crimes, and more interested in her behavior. Women were punished for disobedience, for independence, for speaking out of turn. The concept of scolding was a real legal offense in some towns. A woman who gossiped too much, or argued with her husband, might be labeled a common scold. Her punishment, a device called the scold's bridle, a metal mask that locked over the head and clamped down on the tongue. She would be paraded through the streets, silenced quite literally by iron. Another common punishment was ducking. The woman would be tied to a chair and dunked into a river or pond, over and over again, until she lost consciousness or learned her lesson. It wasn't always fatal, but it was always meant to humiliate. A man could beat his wife with impunity, but if she fought back, even to protect herself, she might face harsher punishment than he ever would. The law assumed that women were naturally deceitful, emotional, and untrustworthy. Their word carried little weight in court. A woman's testimony was often considered valid only if backed by a man's. Even in rape cases, this bias was clear. If a woman accused a man of assault, she had to prove she had screamed for help, loudly enough, and in a populated place. She had to show torn clothing, visible injuries. If she had known the man, or if there was any suggestion she'd been alone with him willingly, the burden of proof shifted entirely onto her. And if she was found to be lying, the consequences were dire. Yet even when the rape was proven, punishments varied wildly. Nobles might pay a fine, peasants might be whipped, and if the rapist was a powerful man, or a clergyman, the woman might be the one punished for tempting him, for not resisting enough, for being there. There were entire legal codes built around female chastity. In some cities, if a woman lost her virginity before marriage, even by force, her family could disown her, or demand she marry her attacker. Honor mattered more than consent. Purity was a legal currency. If it was spent, the woman's value was gone. But what about the church? You might ask. Weren't priests supposed to protect the vulnerable? In theory, yes. In practice, no. The church often enforced the same brutal laws that society did, and sometimes, even harsher ones. Women who defied gender roles could be tried for heresy. Women who used herbs for healing might be labeled witches. The line between sin and crime blurred constantly, and women paid the price. One infamous case from 14th century England tells of a woman named Agnes who was caught healing people with herbs and charms. She was arrested, tortured, and branded a witch. Her crime: she knew how to help women with fertility problems, and didn't ask a priest for permission. In the medieval legal world, knowledge was power, and a woman with power was dangerous. But even when women didn't break the law, they could still be punished. Just existing in the wrong place, wearing the wrong thing, saying the wrong words could land them in trouble. A woman who dressed too finely might be accused of pride. A woman who wore men's clothes, even out of necessity, could be arrested for cross-dressing. Joan of Arc herself was executed, in part, for wearing armor. There was no escape from the law. It wasn't a shield. It was a trap. And yet women survived it, endured it. Some even outwitted it. Some used their roles as midwives or healers to build networks of protection. Some became petitioners, writing to kings or lords to plead for mercy, and surprisingly, some of those petitions worked. A few rare women, like Christine de Pizan, became writers who challenged the misogyny of their time in veiled, careful words. Most, though, had no such recourse, no voice, no record. They lived their entire lives under a legal system that erased them and died without justice. And so, tonight, we remember them too. The silent litigants, the unnamed wives, the punished, the shamed, the accused. Let their stories drift through your mind like soft echoes from a courtroom with no benches. Let their memories breathe, even if the law forgot them. In the next chapter, we'll step into the world of labor and livelihood, where even the backbreaking work of survival was shaped by gender and always came with a price. Picture a medieval village just before sunrise. The air is cold, the ground still wet from night frost. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys. Roosters call out. And there she is, already awake, already working. While history books are filled with kings, battles, and knights, it's easy to forget who kept the world turning in between wars. Who milked the cows, baked the bread, raised the children, and spun the wool. Who tilled the soil, brewed the ale, and sold the eggs. It was women. In the medieval period, most people worked, not in offices or factories, but with their hands and backs. And women were no exception. In fact, their labor was essential, but it was also unpaid, unrecognized, and often brutally hard. For the peasant woman, life was an endless loop of toil. Her day started before the sun rose, and didn't end until long after dark. She would feed the animals, sweep the floor, knead dough, mend clothes, fetch water, and if she had a child on her hip, she did it all one-handed. She worked the land too. In times of harvest or planting, she joined the men in the fields. And unlike what romantic paintings suggest, this wasn't a peaceful life of golden sunlight and blooming flowers. It was mud, blood, and exhaustion. Backs bent for hours, hands blistered raw. No gloves, no tools that made it easier. Just human labor, gritted teeth, and the rhythm of necessity. And still, this wasn't considered a job. It was simply what women were expected to do. Her work didn't earn wages. It didn't build her reputation. It wasn't seen as economic contribution, not officially. And so, though her labor was essential to the survival of the household, the village, the economy, it was invisible. But some women did enter the workforce, at least in name. Medieval towns were home to working women, especially in the lower classes. They were alewives, midwives, seamstresses, laundresses, spinners, maids, and even merchants. Some worked in inns. Some sold vegetables in the market. Others took in boarders or baked bread to sell. Women were allowed to work, as long as their jobs fit within gender expectations. Jobs seen as natural extensions of domestic life. Spinning wool was fine. Brewing beer, acceptable. Making clothes, encouraged. But anything too physical, too skilled, or too visible, was frowned upon. Take the guild system, for example, the heart of the medieval urban economy. Guilds controlled trades, blacksmithing, carpentry, masonry, weaving, baking, and they controlled who could work, who could teach, and who could profit. Women were almost always excluded. Some women participated indirectly. Wives of artisans helped in the workshop, or took over when their husbands died, but they were rarely granted full membership. They couldn't train apprentices. They couldn't vote in guild matters. Their work was often uncredited, even though it was their hands that turned raw wool into fine cloth, or flour into bread. In some cities, women formed their own unofficial networks. In Paris and London, there were records of female brewers who built small brewing empires. In Flanders, women helped power the booming textile trade. But these successes were fragile. One bad season, one rumor, one jealous male competitor, and they could lose everything. There were also limits on where women could work. In many towns, the laws dictated what trades women could enter, what time they could sell goods, even what stalls they could use in the market. A woman who set up shop in the wrong place might be fined, arrested, or simply beaten and driven off. And the worst paid, hardest, most demeaning jobs. Also women's laundresses carried heavy wet linen from riverbanks to drying racks. Their backs ached, their hands froze in winter. They were often targets of abuse, physical, verbal, and sexual. They worked near water and out of doors, which marked them as low status. And yet, someone had to do the work, and it was always women. Domestic servants fared little better. Girls as young as 10 or 11 were sent away to work in noble homes or merchant houses. They cleaned chamber pots, scrubbed floors, dressed their mistresses, and endured constant scolding. Many were abused by their employers, some physically, others sexually. If they became pregnant, they were dismissed and disgraced, even if the father was the master of the house. And yet they had no legal recourse, no protection. Their employment wasn't just a job, it was servitude, bound by poverty and gender. In rural areas, shepherdesses watched flocks through bitter winters and stifling summers. Alone, vulnerable, and exposed, they were often targets of harassment or worse. No one listened to them. No one protected them. In cities, prostitution was technically illegal, but often tolerated, even regulated. Brothels were licensed in some regions, with the justification that they kept men from worse sins. The women who worked in them were often desperate, orphaned, widowed, abandoned, with no other means to survive. Once marked as a prostitute, a woman couldn't easily return to society. She might be branded, denied a Christian burial, or shut out of markets and churches. Some tried to escape, entering convents later in life. Many didn't make it that far. Even noblewomen weren't spared the burden of labor, though their tasks were of a different kind. They managed large households, oversaw servants, coordinated estates, ensured feasts and weddings ran smoothly. And always, their labor was under scrutiny. A noblewoman who failed to keep a clean home, who angered the steward or served a poor meal, could lose reputation, which, in the noble world, meant losing power. There were exceptions, of course, powerful asses, wealthy widows, women who ran estates in their husbands' absences. But these were rare, and even then, they lived under the constant threat of losing everything if they made one wrong move. Because no matter how hard a woman worked, she could always be replaced. Her labor was expected, not celebrated. So tonight, let us remember these women, not the queens in their silks, but the bakers, the shepherdesses, the maids, the midwives, the girls who rose before the sun and fell asleep beside cold hearths, the mothers who brewed ale with crying infants on their backs, the laundresses who carried more than linen, they carried the weight of a world that refused to see them. Their names are mostly lost, but their work built the foundations of everything that followed. She kneels. Her hands are folded, her eyes downcast. A candle flickers beside her, the only light in the cold stone chapel. The walls echo with silence and the smell of wax and mildew. She whispers the same words every day, not in her own language, but in Latin. She doesn't understand them, not really, but she says them anyway, because this is what good women do. In the medieval world, religion was not just belief, it was law, culture, science, education, medicine, and morality, all wrapped together in an unshakable institution, the church. It shaped every part of life. And for women, it shaped every part of suffering. From the cradle to the grave, a woman's spiritual identity was strictly managed. At birth, she was baptized to cleanse her of original sin. From then on, she was told that her soul was tied to Eve, the first woman, the first sinner. The reason, they said, the world had fallen. Eve's legacy haunted women. It was repeated in sermons, carved into church walls, and embedded in the writings of monks and bishops. Women were weak, tempting, dangerous. The flesh was their domain, and the flesh was sinful. So a woman's only hope, her only redemption, was through obedience, silence, and suffering. Priests taught that a woman's highest virtues were chastity, humility, and piety. Virginity was praised as angelic. Marriage was seen as a necessary compromise. And widowhood, if embraced with solemn devotion, was the most respectable stage of all. The choices were narrow: marry and submit, or retreat into a convent. Anything else was dangerous, and possibly heretical. Let's look at those two main paths. First, the married woman, who was expected to serve her husband and raise children in a God-fearing household. Her spiritual life was guided by her husband, who often interpreted the Bible for her. Many women were illiterate, and so they relied on male clergy, who told them what parts of Scripture mattered. And surprisingly, those parts were usually the ones about obedience, modesty, and endurance. Women were told to suffer quietly, because suffering brought them closer to God. If they were beaten, they should pray. If they were betrayed, they should forgive. If they were burdened, they should bear it with grace, because that's what the Virgin Mary would do. But Mary was not a real woman. She was a symbol, perfect, passive, pure, a figure placed on a pedestal so high that no real woman could ever reach it. She bled no real blood, bore no pain of childbirth, and lived only in soft, painted stories. Yet women were told to be like her. And if they failed, if they were loud, proud, sexual, or rebellious, then they were like Eve, or worse, like Lilith. Some women tried to escape the expectations of marriage by entering the church. Becoming a nun was one of the few ways a woman could avoid constant pregnancy and male control. Convents were often the only spaces where women could read, write, study, or lead other women. A few became powerful asses, managing land and overseeing dozens of sisters. But even this spiritual freedom came with chains. A girl might be sent to a convent by her family at age 7 or 8. She had no say, no voice. It was a donation, and once made, it could not be undone. She was cut off from the world, her hair shorn, her clothes replaced with coarse robes, her name sometimes even changed. She spent her days in silence, her nights in prayer. Meals were small and plain. Contact with outsiders was rare. Joy was discouraged. Laughter, sensuality, or curiosity were signs of vanity. The church warned nuns against sinful friendship, especially with other women, a quiet way of policing affection and controlling intimacy. In some orders, self-flagellation was encouraged. A woman would whip herself during prayer, bleeding as a way of proving devotion. Others wore hair shirts, rough, itchy garments under their robes, meant to cause constant discomfort. Some fasted to the point of collapse. A few even starved themselves completely, claiming they lived on the Eucharist alone. They weren't saints, they were sick, but the church called it holiness. And let's not forget how the church policed women's bodies. They weren't just temples, they were threats. Women's clothing was constantly judged. Necklines too low, sleeves too tight, fabric too bright, all could be condemned from the pulpit. Even hairstyles mattered. A woman who wore her hair down might be accused of vanity or lust. Married women had to cover their heads in church, lest they tempt the priest himself. The irony: if a man sinned, he was offered confession and forgiveness. But if a woman sinned, especially sexually, she risked eternal damnation, public shame, or even execution. Adulteresses were stoned in some regions. Pregnant unmarried girls were whipped or sent to religious penitentiaries. Some were forced to take the veil, not out of faith, but as punishment. And in the worst cases, women were accused of witchcraft. A woman who healed with herbs, suspicious. A woman with knowledge of the moon, fertility, or childbirth, dangerous. A woman who lived alone, refused marriage, or had a cat, clearly in league with the devil. She might be tortured until she confessed, drowned, burned, not in the early Middle Ages, but by the later period, especially in the 15th century, witch trials were growing, and the church led them. Some female mystics tried to fight back. Women like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich wrote visions, poems, and sermons. They tried to carve space for women within theology, but they had to walk carefully. They couched their words in divine revelation, claiming their writings came not from themselves, but directly from God. Because a woman who spoke for herself was prideful, but a woman who claimed to be God's mouthpiece, that was allowed barely. So, was there comfort in faith? Yes. Many women found solace in prayer, beauty in ritual, purpose in devotion. Faith was real. Their beliefs were real, but their religious world, the system built around that belief, was not designed for them. It demanded obedience, then punished them for existing, and still, They sang hymns, lit candles, walked barefoot to chapels through snow and wind, not because they were forced to but because they hoped. Because they believed there was something better, somewhere. And maybe that's what makes them remarkable. Not their suffering, but their strength, their belief in grace, even when the world gave them none. So tonight, let the chapel fall silent. Let the candles burn low. And let us remember the women who prayed through pain, who worshipped in fear, who carved their faith into stone walls, and whispered songs in empty halls. The horns sound in the distance. Men rush to the walls with swords and pitchforks. The gates groan shut. Horses scream. Fires are lit along the battlements. And in the corner of a crumbling stone cottage, a woman clutches her children, holding her breath, listening. Because war is coming, and she knows, deep in her bones, that she won't be spared. In history, war is often told as a man's story. Kings and knights, armor and banners, crusades and sieges. But for every battlefield drenched in blood, there was a village, a home, a family, left behind. And in those places, women bore the full, brutal weight of war, not as soldiers, but as casualties in slow motion. Medieval warfare was not clean or contained. Armies weren't made up of trained professionals. They were ragged bands of hungry men, many of them unpaid, restless, and looking for plunder. Towns and farms weren't just caught in the crossfire. They were the targets. And women were seen not just as victims but as spoils. One of the most horrifying aspects of medieval conflict was systemic sexual violence. During sieges and raids, rape was common, not as a side effect, but as a tactic. Soldiers believed they had the right to do whatever they pleased with conquered populations, and no woman was safe. Peasants, noblewomen, nuns, all were vulnerable. If a city resisted too long and was eventually taken, its women were often subjected to days of organized brutality. Chroniclers, writing with chilling detachment, described women being dragged into churches and violated on sacred altars. Pregnant women were not spared. Girls barely into puberty, and grandmothers far past childbearing, were both seen as fair game. And afterward, there was no justice, no recourse. A woman could not accuse a soldier, especially a victorious one. Her pain was considered the price of defeat. Her body, just another piece of broken property. But it didn't end there. In the chaos of war, displacement was a silent killer. Women were the first to lose homes. With their husbands conscripted, captured, or dead, they were left to fend for children and elderly parents, often while fleeing from village to village. Starvation, cold, and disease followed. Imagine carrying a baby on your back while wading through marshes, hiding from soldiers, sleeping in barns, begging for bread. There were no refugee camps, no aid organizations, just fields stripped bare by armies and towns that barred entry to outsiders. And even if she stayed, even if she tried to protect her home, violence still found her. In besieged cities, famine set in fast. Women scavenged rats and roots, boiled leather shoes into soup. Some sold their bodies for bread. Some starved themselves to feed their children. And when food ran out, some women, desperate and ashamed, simply walked into the woods and never came back. One French account from the 100 Years' War describes a woman named Margot who wandered from town to town with 5 children in tow. Her husband had died in battle. Her farm was torched. She begged, stole, worked when she could, but after a harsh winter, only 2 of her children survived. She never stopped walking. She was one of thousands. In war, women also became tools of diplomacy, or more accurately, bargaining chips. Noblewomen were married off to enemy lords to seal alliances. Daughters were used to buy peace. And if they resisted, well, refusal wasn't often an option. Take the case of Isabella of France. Married off at age 12 to Edward II of England. Her marriage was meant to stabilize relations. Instead, she was neglected, humiliated, and eventually used as a political pawn in one of the bloodiest power struggles of the 14th century. Her story is famous, but many like hers remain untold. Even nuns, supposedly protected by the church, were not immune to the horrors of war. Convents were pillaged. Sisters were raped. Holy walls offered little protection against desperate, armed men. Some convents were burned entirely, their inhabitants slaughtered alongside villagers. And when women did fight back, when they armed themselves, hid rebels, or defended their homes, they were seen as unnatural, even monstrous. In one siege, a woman known only as Johanna took up a vow to defend her town. She shot 3 soldiers from the city wall before being caught. Rather than treat her as a prisoner of war, they executed her as a witch, because a woman with a weapon was more terrifying than an army. And yet, women were warriors in their own way. They nursed the wounded with herbs and cloth. They hid fugitives beneath floorboards. They carried messages, smuggled food, forged papers, and risked death just to hold the fragments of a broken world together. These were not the heroics sung in ballads. No one wrote poems about the mother who fed 5 orphans with scraps, or the girl who walked alone through enemy lines to find her sister. But their courage mattered. It mattered more than the armor-clad nobles who claimed glory, because theirs was the courage of survival, and of tending life in a world that celebrated death. And war didn't just break bodies, it broke families. A woman whose husband died in battle was left to raise children with no support. Widows had few legal rights. Often, their land was seized, their sons conscripted, their daughters sold into marriage or servitude. In the aftermath of war, famine and plague followed. The Black Death, for example, struck a generation already weakened by war. Women who had survived soldiers now faced rats and rot, mass graves, silent streets, and endless funerals. No one asked what that kind of grief did to a person. There were no therapists, no rest. The world just went on, grinding through another harvest, another levy, another war. So tonight, let us remember those women, not for how they died, but for how they lived, for how they protected children beneath burning roofs, for how they walked miles on bleeding feet, for how they clung to hope with shaking hands. They were not generals or kings, but they carried the true cost of every war. Let their stories settle now in your thoughts like ash from a dying fire. Let the drumbeats fade. Let the banners fall. The candle light flickers. The room is thick with heat and the smell of sweat. A woman cries out, her fingers gripping the edge of a rough wooden bed. Around her, other women move with quiet urgency, wiping her brow, boiling water, whispering prayers. She's in labor. And in the medieval world, that meant she was hovering between life and death. We often hear that childbirth is natural, that women have always done it, that it's simply part of life. But in the medieval period, it was often the most dangerous event of a woman's life. No hospitals, no anesthetics, no prenatal care, no cesarean sections unless you were already dead. Just your body, your breath, and hope. Most women gave birth at home, in a bed or on a straw mat, surrounded by other women, neighbors, midwives, and older relatives. These women were experienced, yes, but not formally trained. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, whispered from one laboring woman to another. The tools were simple: cloths, bowls of warm water, herbs for pain, and sometimes a carved birthing stool with a hole in the center so gravity could assist. There were no forceps, no sterile gloves, just hands, prayers, and instinct. And it didn't always go well. One of the most terrifying complications was obstructed labor, when the baby wouldn't come out, either because of positioning or size. Without surgery, the only solution was to wait hours, sometimes days. Women screamed until their voices gave out. Some fainted, some bled out, some died with the child still inside them. Others survived, but not intact. A prolonged or difficult birth could result in fistulas, internal tearing that left women incontinent, shamed, and often cast out. These injuries were not understood or treated properly. Some women ended up living alone in huts or cloisters, unable to return to normal life. And if the baby was born, it still wasn't safe. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high. As many as 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday. Mothers were told not to grow too attached too quickly, especially in the early days, when infection, fever, or even a cold could be deadly. A mother might bury several children before one survived to adulthood. Stillbirths were common, too, and they carried not just grief, but spiritual fear, because unless a child was baptized, they were believed to be locked out of heaven, stuck in limbo. If a baby died during labor and wasn't baptized, the mother was blamed, even if she'd done everything right. This spiritual pressure made childbirth even more terrifying. Midwives sometimes performed emergency baptisms mid-delivery, splashing water on the emerging head and whispering Latin prayers, just in case. And mothers, already in agony, were expected to participate in this drama of salvation. Their pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional, eternal. But what about the mothers who survived? They were praised, yes, but also immediately expected to return to work. A woman might give birth in the morning and be stirring a pot of soup by evening. There was no maternity leave, no rest, just the baby on her breast and the loom waiting in the corner. And if she didn't produce milk, there were few options. Wet nurses existed, usually poorer women paid to feed wealthier babies. But most women had no access. Formula didn't exist. Goat's milk wasn't ideal, so a child without breast milk often didn't survive. And there was no birth control, no reproductive choice. A woman could have a dozen pregnancies in her lifetime, starting as early as 13 or 14. Each birth a roll of the dice, each one potentially her last. Many women died in their 20s or 30s, simply from the cumulative strain of childbirth. Repeated pregnancies left them anemic, exhausted, and vulnerable to infection. And even when they survived physically, the emotional toll was profound. Imagine burying child after child. Imagine nursing one baby while pregnant with the next. Imagine always being afraid, not of pain, but of absence. That hollow silence that comes after a baby stops breathing. But motherhood wasn't just birth and death. It was the entire fabric of a woman's identity. Society expected women to find their purpose in motherhood. A childless woman was seen as suspicious, perhaps cursed, or sinful. A woman who rejected motherhood altogether, dangerous. Even women who wanted children were often judged harshly. If their children were too thin, the mother was accused of neglect. If they were too loud, she was called a bad disciplinarian. If they died, she was blamed for not praying enough. There was no way to win. And what of the children who lived? Mothers were expected to raise them, teach them, protect them, but they had no legal rights over them. A child belonged to the father. In many regions, if a husband died, the child's guardianship passed to a male relative, not the mother. She could be removed from her own children's lives, especially if she remarried. Widows were especially vulnerable. Some were forced to give up their children in exchange for financial support. Others had their children taken by lords or religious institutions. The grief was immense, and no one cared. And through it all, women were told, this is your purpose, your blessing, your divine duty. And yet, despite everything, mothers loved fiercely. They sang lullabies over cradles made of rough wood. They carved toys from scraps. They embroidered names into tiny cloths. They passed on stories and songs, even when their hands shook from hunger. They braided hair and kissed scraped knees, and watched with quiet pride as their children walked, talked, and sometimes, against all odds, thrived. Their love was deep, but it was not easy, because in the medieval world, to be a mother was to live always at the edge of loss, to give everything, knowing you might get nothing back but a memory. So tonight, let us light a candle in the dark room of history. Let it burn for every woman who died giving life, for every mother who held a stillborn child, for every girl who became a mother too soon, for every woman who was told her body belonged to someone else, and who still found the strength to hold her child close and whisper, "You are mine." She stands in the square. Her feet are bare. Her dress is torn. The crowd whispers, then shouts, then laughs. A bailiff reads charges aloud, words she barely understands. A priest mutters prayers beside her. And when the sentence is passed, there is no surprise, just silence. Then ropes, stones, or maybe fire, because in the eyes of the law, she was always guilty. In medieval Europe, law wasn't a system of fairness. It was a tool of control, especially when it came to women. Courts were often extensions of feudal power or church authority, and justice was less about truth and more about reinforcing hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, women sat firmly at the bottom. Let's begin with basic legal status. A woman was not considered a full legal person. Her identity was tied to a man, her father, her husband, or, if widowed, her son. She couldn't own property freely, sign contracts, or represent herself in most legal cases. In some regions, her testimony wasn't even admissible in court, not because she was dishonest, but because women were seen as too emotional to be reliable. Even noble women, those with land and wealth, had to fight for any shred of autonomy. And if they did fight, they were seen as unnatural, manlike, or wicked. The law didn't just restrict women, it humiliated them. Let's talk about crime and punishment. If a man committed a crime, he could be fined, jailed, or pardoned, depending on his status. But if a woman committed the same crime, the consequences were often far harsher, and always more public. Take adultery. When a man strayed, it was seen as unfortunate but understandable. Boys will be boys. But when a woman was unfaithful, or even just accused of being unfaithful, the punishment could be death. She might be whipped, branded, forced to wear a shame mask, or paraded through the town in a cart. One 13th century law in Germany allowed husbands to legally kill their wives for adultery, no trial needed. And even if she was innocent, suspicion alone was enough to ruin her life. Then there were the ordeals, brutal physical tests designed to prove guilt or innocence. These were often used in religious courts or local disputes. If a woman was accused of theft, blasphemy, or witchcraft, she might be forced to walk over hot plowshares, hold a red-hot iron bar, be submerged in water. If she burned or sank, or floated, whatever the outcome, it could be twisted into proof of guilt. It was a no-win situation. Even more sinister were the witch trials. Though most famous in the later medieval and early modern periods, the groundwork was laid centuries earlier. The church taught that women were more likely to be tempted by the devil, more prone to sin, and more susceptible to hysteria. This meant that a woman who was independent, outspoken, or skilled in herbal medicine could be branded a witch. Evidence wasn't necessary. A strange birthmark, a difficult neighbor, a dream, anything could be twisted into proof. Some women were tortured into confessions. Others were drowned or burned alive. Whole villages turned on widows, healers, and midwives. The law, instead of protecting the innocent, became a weapon of fear. Let's look at marriage laws too. Married women had almost no legal power. Their property became their husband's. Their bodies became his as well. Marital rape didn't exist in legal terms, because once married, a woman was assumed to have given eternal consent. If a husband beat his wife, the law often looked the other way. As long as he didn't kill her, it was considered a domestic matter. In fact, some legal codes allowed a man to beat his wife with a stick, as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. That's where the old saying, rule of thumb, supposedly comes from, though the origin is debated. And if she tried to leave, good luck. Divorce was virtually impossible for most women. Annulments were rare and expensive. If a woman ran away, she could be branded a criminal, a fugitive from her own marriage. Let's talk about sexual violence. Rape laws did exist, but they were deeply flawed. In many regions, the crime of rape was seen not as a violation of the woman, but a violation of her male guardian's property. If a woman was raped, her attacker could sometimes pay a fine, not to her, but to her father or husband. And if the woman was unmarried and her rapist agreed to marry her, the charges might be dropped entirely, because in the eyes of the law, her virginity was a commodity, and if that could be restored by marriage, justice was served. Imagine that. Being forced to marry the man who violated you, living every day with the face of your trauma. Even worse, some women who reported rape were punished themselves, accused of tempting the man, dressing improperly, or lying for attention. Many victims stayed silent. The risk was too great. The law was not their friend. But justice wasn't just about punishment. It was also about protection, and women had very little of that. If a woman was robbed, she had to rely on a man to press charges. If she was cheated in business, the same. If her husband abandoned her, took her children, or refused to support her, she had almost no recourse. And yet some women fought back. In rare cases, brave women took their cases to court. A few even won. There are records of women suing for stolen dowries, unfair marriages, and abusive treatment. These women were outliers, often literate, wealthy, or backed by powerful allies. But they show that resistance, however small, existed. Still, the system was not designed for them. Even in the best circumstances, the medieval legal world was a cage. A woman could be punished for being too loud, too quiet, too sexual, too celibate, too rich, too poor, too alive. So tonight, let us walk quietly through the empty town square. The torches are out. The platform is empty. The crowd has gone home. But the echoes remain, of women, judged not by their actions, but by their existence. Let us remember them, not just the accused and condemned, but the everyday women who lived under a system designed to silence them. The iron door creaks open. The cell is dark, cold. Damp stone walls glisten with moisture. A single slit high on the wall lets in a sliver of gray light. In the corner, curled on straw, a woman stirs. Her wrists are raw from the manacles. Her lips are cracked. Her eyes, once sharp, now stare into nothing. She's been here for weeks or months. No one has told her why. No one will. In the medieval world, imprisonment was not a sentence. It was a waiting room, often for something worse. And for women, the experience of prison was a world of silent suffering, invisible punishment, and forgotten lives. Unlike modern prisons, which are supposed to serve as correctional institutions, medieval prisons were chaotic, filthy holding places. They weren't organized or regulated. There were no cells with numbers, no scheduled meals, no beds, no sanitation. Most prisons were just damp basements, tower rooms, or abandoned corners of castles. And women weren't housed separately. In fact, many women were locked up with men. No guards, no protections, just straw on the floor, rats in the corners, and predators all around. Abuse, physical and sexual, was common. Often, jailers demanded money or favors for food, for warmth, or for the privilege of staying alive. The jailer wasn't a civil servant. He was a businessman. You paid to be imprisoned. If you were poor and couldn't afford bribes, you starved. If you had no family to bring food, you begged. If you were sick, you died. And no one came to collect the body. But what brought a woman to prison? The answers varied, and were often disturbingly vague. Sometimes it was petty theft, a loaf of bread, a chicken, a length of cloth. Sometimes it was gossip, saying the wrong thing about the wrong person. Sometimes it was disobedience to a husband, a landlord, or a priest. And sometimes there was no reason at all. A woman could be locked away for being disruptive, unwomanly, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were cases where women were imprisoned to stop them from testifying in trials, or to pressure their families, or to prevent scandal. Once inside, they vanished from the world. No lawyers, no appeals, no time limits. You stayed until someone paid to get you out, or until the authorities decided what to do with you. And in many cases, what they decided was far worse than prison. Punishments were often designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate. For women, public shame was part of the sentence. Let's take a walk through some of these punitive spectacles. The pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, placed in the middle of a public square. A woman would be locked in place for hours, sometimes days, as townspeople threw rotten food, stones, or worse. The scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the head, with a spike inserted into the mouth to prevent speaking. It was used on women accused of gossip, nagging, or arguing with men, the so-called shrews. Imagine the agony, the shame, and all for having an opinion. The ducking stool, a chair mounted on a long beam over a river. The woman was strapped in and dunked repeatedly in the freezing water. Sometimes it was punishment, sometimes a test, for witchcraft, for lying, or for refusing a man's authority. Branding, a hot iron applied to the skin, usually the hand, face, or chest. A permanent mark of crime. Some were branded with letters, T for thief, A for adulteress, B for blasphemer. These letters didn't just scar skin, they ruined lives. Whipping, often done publicly, with the crowd encouraged to mock the victim. Whips tore skin, broke spirits, and left lasting wounds, all in the name of morality. And then, of course, there were the executions. Women could be hanged for theft, burned for heresy, buried alive for infanticide. Some were drowned in barrels. Others were stoned. Some, particularly accused witches or poisoners, were tortured first, forced to confess before the crowd. There was no mercy, no dignity, just pain and spectacle. Even noble women were not immune. Though they might avoid the most vulgar punishments, they could still be confined, in castles, towers, or convents, cut off from the world. This was called honorable imprisonment. But make no mistake, it was still a cage. Isabella of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and even queens were placed under house arrest, or confined for political reasons. Their wealth and titles didn't protect them from isolation, silence, and despair. For lower-class women, there was no pretense of honor. In England, the 13th century document the Mirror of Justices, stated that women were more likely to sin, and therefore required stronger discipline. That idea, that women were inherently prone to mischief, justified centuries of abuse under the guise of correction. But what happens after punishment? Nothing. No healing. No rehabilitation. No support. Women left prison physically broken, socially ruined, and economically devastated. Employers wouldn't hire them. Landlords wouldn't rent to them. Families, ashamed or afraid, often turned them away. So they ended up on the streets, or back in jail, or worse. Some women joined traveling bands, surviving through theft, prostitution, or disguise. Others entered beguinages, semi-religious communities for women who couldn't marry or return home. A few, like Marjorie Kemp, found strange fame as mystics or visionaries. But most disappeared, forgotten by records, forgotten by history, forgotten even by the people who once knew them. So tonight, as we close the door on this cold, stone cell, let us pause. Let us remember the women who sat in darkness, who were punished not for crimes, but for being inconvenient, loud, unmarried, poor, too much, not enough. They left no last words, no final letters, just scratches on the wall, prayers whispered in the straw, and stories carried only in silence. The bell tolls softly. A line of women moves through a stone corridor, their bare feet silent on the cold floor. Candlelight flickers on their faces, pale, still, serene. They wear simple wool robes, belted at the waist. No jewelry, no loose hair, no names spoken above a whisper. Just silence, prayer, and obedience. This is a convent. But is it sanctuary or prison? In the medieval world, the cloistered life was one of the few spaces women could claim as their own. Here, they could read, write, teach, and sometimes even lead. But behind the walls of every convent lay another truth, that for many women, this so-called escape was just another kind of exile. Let's begin with the choice, or lack of one. For some women, entering a convent was voluntary. They were drawn to a life of spiritual devotion. They longed for silence, prayer, and the company of other women. These were the mystics, the thinkers, the seekers of something beyond the rigid roles of wife or mother. But many others had no choice at all. Girls as young as 7 were promised to convents by their families. This wasn't always out of piety. It was often economical. A noble family with multiple daughters couldn't afford all their dowries. So one, often the quiet one, or the sickly one, would be sent to the nuns. This was called a spiritual dowry, a gift to the church. But the girl, she was never consulted. Other women were forced into convents after scandal, an affair, a pregnancy, or even just a rumor. A family could preserve its honor by hiding the problem behind cloistered walls, out of sight, out of shame. Still others entered convents after being widowed or abandoned, with no husband and no means of survival. A religious community was often the only shelter available. It was refuge, but it was also resignation. So what was life like inside? Structured, quiet, repetitive. The day was divided by bells, not clocks. Matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime, terce, sext, nuns, vespers, and compline. 7 times a day, the nuns gathered to chant prayers, read psalms, and sit in long, hushed rows. Between services, they worked. Some sewed or copied manuscripts. Others tended gardens, baked bread, cared for the sick. Meals were simple: bread, beans, porridge, eaten in silence as a sister read aloud from scripture or the lives of saints. Talking was discouraged, so was laughter. Personal belongings were limited. Mirrors were rare. Baths were occasional. Hair was hidden. Identity was surrendered. A nun gave up her family name, her clothes, even her voice. And yet, within these restrictions, some found freedom. Unlike secular women, nuns could read and write, especially in Benedictine or Cistercian houses. They preserved books, penned histories, composed music, and painted illuminated manuscripts. Some convents were small hubs of art and learning. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century ass, became famous for her visions, music, and scientific writings. She wrote letters to emperors, argued with bishops, and composed symphonies, all from within the convent walls. But Hildegard was the exception, not the rule. Most nuns lived quiet, unrecorded lives, laboring, praying, aging. The average nun never left the convent grounds. The rule of Saint Benedict forbade frequent visits from outsiders. Walls were high, doors locked, and for good reason, because the line between protection and imprisonment was thin. Some convents functioned as reformatories, housing fallen women or disgraced daughters. These women weren't considered true nuns. They were separated, punished, sometimes shamed into obedience. Others were political prisoners in all but name, noblewomen whose ambitions made them dangerous, cloistered to keep them silent. And even inside the convent, male control remained. A convent couldn't operate without a male priest or bishop. All sacraments, mass, confession, communion, had to be administered by men. Nuns had spiritual authority only over each other. They could lead within, but never without. There were also financial restrictions. Many convents were poor. Some relied on alms, donations, or hard labor. Others were wealthy, endowed by noble patrons. But even then, their wealth was managed by male clerics. A nun could grow vegetables and sell them at market, but she couldn't control the profits. And scandals did happen. There were cases of forbidden love, secret affairs between nuns and visiting priests, or even between the sisters themselves. Some convents became notorious for lax rules and unruly behavior. Others were models of order and sanctity. But even the best houses had cracks, because no matter how holy the walls, they could not erase human longing. Some nuns ran away. Others wrote desperate letters to the outside world, begging to return home. A few went mad, the silence and suppression becoming too much. The cloister promised peace, but for some, it delivered isolation. Still, many stayed, and even thrived. They cultivated herbs, healed the sick, taught young girls. They found friendship, stability, and purpose. Some wrote poetry. Some ruled as aesses, powerful women with authority over dozens of others. In a world where most women had no voice, the convent offered a rare stage. But it was not paradise. It was often the least bad option. A life of prayer might be better than a life of abuse. A cold cell preferable to a dangerous marriage. A habit safer than a home. But safety came at the cost of freedom, and silence was the price of survival. So tonight, as the final bell rings, and the cloister gates close, let us listen, not for the chants, but for the whispers, the hidden hopes, the quiet rebellions, the dreams left folded between pages of worn prayer books. Let us honor the women who found sanctuary in stone walls, and those who were buried behind them. Imagine the silence of a medieval court, the air thick with incense, men in furs and gold, monks scribbling records, priests muttering blessings. And then, a woman speaks. The room stiffens, a murmur, a ripple of discomfort, because a woman, especially one who defies, is always a disruption. And yet, in a world that silenced women at every turn, a few rose to command armies, shape theology, rule kingdoms, or simply refused to vanish. These were the exceptional women of the medieval period, not spared from brutality, but shaped by it, not protected, but hardened. Let's begin with the queens, not just wives to kings, but rulers in their own right. Eleanor of Aquitaine is perhaps the most famous. Born in 1122, she was heiress to a vast region of France and married not one, but two kings, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England. She led armies during the Second Crusade, defied her husband's rule, and supported her sons in a rebellion. For this, she was imprisoned for 16 years. But she never broke. She governed lands, brokered treaties, and lived long enough to see her son, Richard the Lionheart, crowned king. Eleanor was called dangerous, willful, immoral. In truth, she was brilliant and feared. Then there's Isabella of France, the she-wolf of France. Married to the ineffectual Edward II of England, she eventually led an invasion of England, overthrew her husband, and ruled as regent for her young son, Edward III. She was criticized, demonized, and eventually forced into retirement. But she changed the course of English history. These women were not gentle. They couldn't afford to be. Power, for them, meant constant scrutiny, suspicion, and threat. They walked tightropes of diplomacy, motherhood, and political chess. And even at their peak, they were never safe. From queens to rebels, one name burns bright: Joan of Arc. Born to a peasant family in France in 1412, Joan claimed divine visions. At 17, she led French troops into battle, dressed in armor, carrying a banner, and helped turn the tide of the 100 Years' War. She convinced a doubtful king, outwitted seasoned generals, and rallied soldiers. But what terrified people wasn't just her military success. It was her defiance of gender. A woman in armor, a peasant with visions, a girl commanding men. Captured by the English, she was tried by a church court. They charged her with heresy, witchcraft, and, above all, wearing men's clothing. That was the detail that enraged them most. In 1431, she was burned alive at the stake, her ashes thrown into the Seine. 25 years later, her trial was overturned. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint. But in her own time, she died screaming in the flames for defying the role assigned to her. Not all defiance was loud. Some women challenged the system through mysticism, visions, trances, and ecstatic devotion. These women didn't seek worldly power, but they terrified the authorities all the same. Take Julian of Norwich, a 14th century anchorite, who lived in a single room attached to a church. She wrote Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in English known to be written by a woman. In it, she described visions of Christ, not as a stern judge, but as a nurturing, maternal figure. God is our mother, she wrote, words that danced on the edge of heresy. She never left her cell, yet her voice carried through centuries. Or Marjorie Kemp, a mystic, mother of 14, and spiritual pilgrim. She dictated the first known autobiography in English. In it, she described visions of Jesus, ecstatic weeping in churches, arguments with clergy, and refusal to obey her husband's sexual demands. She was tried multiple times for heresy and jailed, but never executed. She wandered Europe in a white robe, barefoot, often mocked, but never silenced. Even in convents, women found ways to speak. Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned earlier, was a German ass who composed music, authored medical texts, and advised emperors. She received divine visions and turned them into theological works that challenged church doctrine. Her writings were bold, strange, and deeply influential. She called out corruption, championed the sacredness of the earth, and believed in cosmic harmony. The church tried to ignore her. They couldn't. Her letters reached the highest ranks. These women walked dangerous lines. They were praised and persecuted in equal measure. Some were canonized, others condemned, but all of them, in their own way, refused to disappear. Even ordinary women resisted. We have records of women defending villages, running taverns, suing landlords, breaking out of arranged marriages, hiding fugitives, forging letters, or fighting off tax collectors. Their names are mostly lost, their stories scattered in court rolls and parish records. But they lived. They survived, not by obedience, but by cleverness, strength, and small, daily acts of rebellion. Of course, for every woman who defied, there were countless more who couldn't, or wouldn't, take the risk, and who could blame them. The cost was high. Speak too boldly, and you were a heretic. Act too boldly, and you were a witch. Love too boldly, and you were a whore. Even the brave were punished. But tonight, let's honor them anyway. The queens who ruled, the mystics who dreamed, the rebels who bled, and the peasant girls who dared to say, just once, no. Because even in a world built to break them, some women refuse to be broken. The room is dark, close, smelling of sweat, wax, and blood. A fire crackles low in the hearth, but the warmth doesn't reach the stone walls. A woman lies on a straw-filled mattress, legs parted, face twisted in agony. Around her are other women, older, experienced, grim. A midwife kneels at her feet. A maid wipes her brow. A prayer is whispered. The woman screams. This is childbirth in the medieval world. It is not joyous. It is not peaceful. It is not safe. It is a gamble with death, every single time. In the medieval period, motherhood was seen as a woman's ultimate purpose. She was expected to marry young, conceive often, and bear as many children as possible. But the more she fulfilled that role, the closer she came to the grave. Let's talk numbers. Historians estimate that 1 in 3 women died from complications related to childbirth over the course of their lives. Not every time, but eventually, and those who survived one birth had no guarantee they'd survive the next. Women gave birth over and over, often without rest between pregnancies. There was no understanding of prenatal care, no safe methods of contraception, no concept of a woman's physical limits. Pregnancy was not just likely, It was expected. Girls married as young as 12 or 13. Many became mothers before their bodies were ready. Their bones were still growing. Their pelvis is too narrow. Childbirth at that age could rupture internal organs, tear tissue, or cause lasting damage. And yet, the pressure to produce heirs, especially sons, was immense. A woman who failed to conceive was often blamed, scorned, or cast aside. A noble woman who bore only daughters risked being replaced or exiled. A peasant wife who couldn't bear children might be abandoned or accused of being cursed. Even during pregnancy, there was little knowledge of how to ensure a healthy birth. Women continued to work, carry loads, feed animals, and tend fields well into their third trimester. There were no prenatal vitamins, no sterile environments, no ultrasounds, just hope and fear. When labor began, the world narrowed to a single room, often called a birthing chamber. The windows were shuttered, the door was closed. No men were allowed inside. It was a female space, but not a gentle one. The midwife led the process. She brought hot water, clean linens, if they were lucky, herbs, and charms. She said prayers, gave instructions, and prepared for blood. Lots of blood, because childbirth was trauma. Without anesthesia, every contraction was agony. Prolonged labor could last for days. Babies came feet first, sideways, tangled in cords. The mother screamed. The midwife pushed, cut, turned. And if something went wrong, there was no surgeon to step in, no cesarean section, unless the mother was already dying. Many babies were stillborn. Many mothers died of hemorrhage, infection, or shock. And the ones who survived were left broken. There were no stitches, no physical therapy, no aftercare. Women suffered from fistulas, internal tears that left them leaking waste uncontrollably. Many were abandoned or hidden away, seen as unclean. Others became infertile, and thus, useless in the eyes of society. And yet, these women were called lucky because they lived. The unlucky ones were buried quietly, their infants with them, often unnamed, forgotten. Religion didn't help. In fact, it made things worse. The church taught that women were cursed with painful childbirth because of Eve's sin. Genesis 3:16, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. Pain was seen as holy. Suffering was sacred. To numb it, if such a thing were even possible, would have been viewed as resisting God's will. So there were no attempts at pain relief, no herbal anesthesia, no comfort for the dying. Worse still, the baby had to be baptized quickly, or its soul was believed to be lost. If the child was stillborn, unbaptized, or died before a priest could arrive, it was denied burial in consecrated ground. Mothers begged midwives to baptize dying babies, even with spit, blood, or wine, just to save their souls. Imagine the pressure, the panic, the fear. Not only was a woman expected to survive childbirth, but she had to ensure her baby's eternal salvation as well. There were prayers, dozens of them, written specifically for labor. Some women tied holy relics around their stomachs. Others prayed to saints like Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron of childbirth, who was said to have burst out of a dragon's belly unharmed, a metaphorical caesarean of divine proportions. But saints did not always answer. Relics did not always work. And if a woman died, her work was still not done. A noble woman's corpse might be cut open to remove the child for burial. A peasant mother might be left in the same bed where she labored, wrapped in the same bloody sheets. Mourning was brief. There were other mouths to feed, other fields to till, other babies on the way. Because there was no pause, no respite, no space for grief, the surviving children, if any, were swaddled, breastfed, if the mother lived, or passed to a wet nurse, if she didn't. Infant mortality was staggering. Up to half of all children died before the age of 5. Many women watched baby after baby fade in their arms, from fever, diarrhea, or simple hunger. Still, they kept going, because that was their duty, their role, their burden. Medieval motherhood was not soft lullabies or tender moments. It was exhaustion, fear, and sacrifice. It was bleeding in silence, rocking a cradle one day and digging a grave the next. It was losing your name, replaced by good wife, mother, widow. And if a woman dared to mourn too openly, to say it was too much, she risked being called weak, or worse, selfish. Because in the medieval world, a mother's pain was not just expected, it was invisible. So tonight, as we blow out the candle in this shadowed birthing room, let us remember the women who suffered quietly, the ones whose names never made the records, the ones who brought life into the world at the cost of their own, the women who were told their pain was holy, their death expected, their love duty. The medieval world was not static. It cracked, shifted, and evolved, slowly, unevenly, and often painfully. And though life for women remained brutally hard through most of the period, change was stirring. Tiny, almost invisible at first, like hairline fractures in a stone wall, but real. And sometimes, change begins in the quietest of places. In a candlelit scriptorium, where a nun carefully copies a psalm in Latin. In a bustling market, where a widow argues the price of her wool. In a city alley, where a young girl learns to read in secret. These are the first stirrings of transformation. Let's begin with literacy, or rather, its slow, creeping spread. For most of the early medieval period, reading and writing were the domain of the church. Latin was the language of the educated, and the educated were almost exclusively male. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, something remarkable began to happen. Vernacular languages, English, French, Italian, German, began to flourish in literature, poetry, and song. This meant that reading was no longer only for priests and monks, and some women, especially those in convents or wealthy households, began to learn. Literacy offered something radical, a way to think, remember, and express without asking permission. A woman who could read could copy a prayer, understand a contract, or write a letter. She might never leave her village, but with a book in hand, she could enter entirely different worlds. Some women became scribes, translators, even authors. We know of women like Marie de France, who wrote courtly tales and fables in Anglo-Norman French in the 12th century. Her writings showed emotional depth, intelligence, and most importantly, a female voice. Even more revolutionary, some women began writing about women. They questioned traditional roles, critiqued marriage, and defended their sex. One extraordinary example is Christine de Pizan, a 15th century widow and professional writer. Yes, professional, who supported herself through her pen. In the Book of the City of Ladies, she imagined a symbolic city populated entirely by virtuous, intelligent women from history and legend. She argued that women were not inherently inferior, just oppressed by custom and denied education. This was dynamite, quiet dynamite, written in polite verse, but still, it exploded assumptions. Meanwhile, in the towns and cities, another change was brewing. Trade. The rise of towns in the later medieval period opened new economic opportunities. Markets grew, guilds formed, crafts expanded, and although most guilds were dominated by men, some allowed women, especially widows, to inherit their husband's trade. A woman might run a brewery, a bakery, or a cloth shop. She might mend shoes, dye wool, or weave linen. In London, Paris, Bruges, and Florence, women were working, visibly, skillfully, and for profit. Some became quite successful. We have records of women paying taxes, hiring apprentices, and even taking other merchants to court over debts. A woman might not have full legal autonomy, but in practice, some found ways to operate with relative independence. Still, there were limits. Most women's work was seen as an extension of the household, not a profession. If she ran a shop, it was seen as helping her husband. If she baked bread, it was called housework. But money changed hands, skills were passed on, and female networks, informal but powerful, began to take shape. Some cities even had female-only guilds, particularly in textile production. Lace makers, embroiderers, and spinners formed their own associations. In these circles, knowledge was shared, daughters were trained, and reputations were built. Another unexpected arena of influence. Medicine. Though the formal universities barred women, healing was considered a natural, female task, especially midwifery and herbal medicine. Women became known as wise women, herbalists, and midwives, passing down knowledge through generations. In the city of Salerno, Italy, the Trotula text emerged, a collection of medical writings that focused on women's health, likely compiled in part by female practitioners. These texts were used for centuries, and some bear the imprint of female authorship. But again, caution. because knowledge that empowered women was deeply feared. A wise woman could quickly become a suspected witch. The same herbs that healed could be called spells. A midwife who lost a baby could be accused of sorcery. As women gained small footholds of power, they also faced new dangers. Even within marriage, subtle changes were appearing. By the later medieval period, the church had redefined marriage as a sacrament, not just a legal contract. This meant that a marriage, in theory, required mutual consent. In practice, this didn't stop forced or arranged marriages, but it did give some women a tool. If a girl could prove she was married against her will, she could appeal to the church courts. It was rare. It was difficult, but it happened. We even have records of women ailing marriages or fighting for inheritance rights in court. Again, this was mostly limited to wealthier classes. Peasant women had far fewer options, but even a few cracks in the wall were significant. Then there was the Black Death. It devastated Europe in the 14th century, killing up to half the population. The scale of the death was catastrophic, but the aftermath brought strange and unexpected shifts. With so many people gone, labor became scarce, and suddenly, women's work mattered more. Some women inherited land, others took on new roles. The rigid feudal structure began to tremble, and when the social order shook, opportunity crept in through the fissures. Finally, we must look at art, song, and folklore. Women's voices, though often filtered through male scribes, appear in ballads, riddles, and oral tales. Songs of wives left alone, stories of clever maids who outwit lords, proverbs that praise female wisdom, lullabies sung in kitchens, chants whispered during weaving. These were not political treatises or theological arguments, but they mattered. They shaped how women saw themselves, and how they were remembered. Because history is not just made by queens and rebels. It's made in the market stalls, the kitchens, the convents, the alleyways. And even when women had no ink, no paper, and no audience, they still found ways to speak. So yes, the medieval period was brutal for women, but it was not empty of progress. There were voices, there were thinkers, there were tradeswomen, writers, midwives, and quiet revolutionaries. And every act, every word written, skill passed, rule questioned, planted a seed. Some were trampled, others took root, but all of them mattered. The candle has burned low, the night deepens, the tapestries rustle with the draught, and the women, the mothers, mystics, queens, peasants, rebels, seem to drift back into shadow, but they don't disappear, because the brutal realities they lived through still echo through time. They shaped the world we live in now, in ways that are quiet, subtle, and often unspoken. Let's begin with the most obvious echo, the enduring expectation of a woman's role. In the medieval period, a woman was defined by her relation to men, as daughter, wife, or widow. Her value lay in her fertility, her obedience, her chastity. The patriarchal model was not questioned, it was enforced by law, custom, and God. And while we've come a long way, traces remain. Even now, women in many parts of the world are expected to marry young, bear children, and conform to gendered expectations. Access to education, autonomy over one's body, and legal protections remain uneven and contested. It's not the same as it was, but the structure built 1,000 years ago still casts a long shadow. The medieval church taught that a woman's suffering was sacred. Her pain was a consequence of Eve, her silence, a virtue. These ideas embedded themselves deep into the cultural soil of Europe, and sprouted in surprising ways. They shaped the language of modesty, of shame, of morality. They gave rise to centuries of legal and social systems that distrusted women's intellect, questioned their testimony, and controlled their bodies. These aren't just old stories. They're the foundations of the modern world. But history is not only inheritance, it's also instruction. So what can we learn from the brutal lives of medieval women? First, we learn about resilience, the ability to endure, not quietly, but creatively. These women were not passive victims. They worked, plotted, prayed, healed, wrote, raised children, made deals, buried loved ones, and got up the next day to do it again. They navigated a system that told them they were weak, and proved it wrong with every breath. Second, we learn about visibility. History has often ignored women. They were seen as irrelevant to politics, warfare, and great events. But when we widen the lens, when we look beyond kings and battles, we see that women were always there. shaping society from within. They kept economies running, passed down medical knowledge, created art, and formed communities of care and resistance. To understand the medieval world, or any world, you must look at the margins. That's where the real stories begin. Third, we learn about change, how it starts not with revolution, but with small, persistent acts. A nun learning to write, a midwife teaching her apprentice, a mother telling her daughter, "You can." These aren't grand gestures, but they accumulate. They build over centuries, and they make transformation possible. The seeds planted in the Middle Ages, in manuscripts, markets, and songs, bore fruit long after their planters had died, and some are still growing today. Fourth, we learn the cost of silence. Many medieval women were never allowed to speak for themselves. Their voices were filtered, forgotten, or erased, and when they did speak, through poems, prayers, court records, they were often punished, which makes what we do now, reading their words, remembering their names, a kind of quiet justice. We cannot undo their suffering, but we can listen. Finally, we must remember that the brutality they faced was not natural. It was constructed, enforced, taught, maintained, which means it can be dismantled. The systems that oppressed medieval women weren't inevitable. They were built, and they took centuries to crack. But crack they did, because women resisted, persisted, and imagined something better. That resistance still matters. When women today demand education, healthcare, safety, and respect, they're not asking for something new. They're asking for what was denied for 1,000 years. And they're standing on the shoulders of those who came before, whether queens in crowns or peasants in patched skirts. So let us end this long, quiet journey with one final image, not of a battlefield, not of a throne room, but of a woman in a dim room, holding a pen, her name lost, her fingers ink-stained, her lamp guttering. She writes a sentence, maybe a prayer, maybe a letter, maybe a memory, and she presses it into the page, not knowing if anyone will ever read it. You just did, and in that, her voice lives on.